Hi, everyone. Happy first day of summer. We're so glad you're here with us today. As we get settled in and people start coming into the program, I hope you'll share in the chat where you're joining us from. Let's go ahead and put that in there. So welcome to today's program, Election 2024, Crafting Sharp and Responsible Headlines for Your Political Stories. My name is Bara Vaida. I'm the Director of Training for the National Press Club Journalism Institute. We're based in Washington, D.C., and our nonprofit organization provides training and support for journalists with the mission of powering journalism in the public interest. I'm so glad to welcome you here to today's program. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items. We have a closed captioning option available. If you're joining us on a desktop or a laptop, you can enable this at any time by finding the CC Live transcription button in the navigation menu at the bottom of your Zoom window. You're going to click Show Subtitle and the captioning will start. We're recording this program and a link will be emailed to you. Also, the recording will be included in Monday's newsletter, The Latest. If you aren't already subscribed to our afternoon newsletter on the media, we'll add the link to the chat now, so please sign up. And today's program is designed as both a conversation and a training, and we hope that you'll join in with your thoughts during the program in the chat. So make sure you set your chat to reply everyone instead of just to the panelists. And then if you have a specific question during this program, please share it in that Q&A queue. We recommend putting it there so it doesn't get lost in the chat, and we'll be monitoring those questions and responding to them during the program. Now, I want to turn this over to our fantastic instructor today, Aubrey Nagle. She's the Director of Practice Change at Resolve Philly, which aims to connect newsrooms with readers in ways that inspire more equitable and accurate representation and creates tools and resources to help journalists use more inclusive and human-centered language in their reporting. Before she joined Resolve Philly, Aubrey was the newsletter editor at the Philadelphia Inquirer. So thanks so much for leading this program today. We are so grateful. Please take it away from here.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for joining us today. I see some Philly folks in the chat. That is where I am calling in from. So it's great to see other Philly folks. We're going to get started in just a second. I'm going to share my screen. And as Bara said, please, send your questions throughout and I will try to answer them as we go. And we'll have some time at the end specifically dedicated to questions as well. I'm going to share my screen for you all. All right. I'm going to get my chat window open so I can make sure to see all of your thoughts. Okay, great. All right, so this is Election 2024, Crafting Sharp and Responsible Headlines for Your Political Stories. A little bit about me. As Bara mentioned, I work at Resolve Philly. Resolve Philly is a nonprofit newsroom based in Philadelphia. What I do there as the Director of Practice Change is lead Modifier. Modifier is our professional development arm. We have learned a lot over the past few years of working with newsrooms and community organizations to create really collaborative, human-centered journalism. And we do trainings, workshops, one-on-one coaching and consulting with organizations, mission-aligned nonprofits, newsrooms, researchers, anyone who might need help with collaboration or community engagement, workplace culture, or language and framing. Language and framing is the section of content that I lead, so that's what we'll be talking about today. But we work with all four of those areas of expertise and more in impact tracking, source tracking. So got to do a little plug for that. If you would like to reach out to me and learn more about that, feel free to email me at aubrey@resolvephilly.org. So just to also give you a little bit of context about my perspective on journalism and what we'll be talking about today from headlines, I want to put out a few blanket statements that I believe journalism should be overtly pro-democracy. As we're heading into these elections, I think we should be working from the assumption that our audiences want a democracy in the US, and thus we can present things to them as good and bad for democracy when that is clear. It isn't always, but when that is. And I believe from this perspective, there's a big difference between overtly and purposefully supporting one candidate versus being straightforward about the threat that a different candidate poses to the existence of democracy. We need to be able to be clear about that, and you'll see that throughout this presentation today. I also believe journalism should be really human-centered through and through. We should be working from the basis of our community's needs, their information needs, and providing them with information that helps all of us solve our collective problems. I think that's what journalism should be. And so I think headlines, being a big part of that, should also focus on these tenets. So that's where I'm coming from. As for the next hour or so of time, I want to say we are entering a judgment-free zone. There are going to be examples of headlines and like screenshots, and this is not to pick on any of those specific outlets or the headline writers. If you have written similar headlines, this is not to judge you. These are just best practices that we have learned through talking with our community and studying research and communication theory that we are presenting today. We are in a judgment-free zone. So I want to put that out there. And but to get started, I have a question for all of you, which is, what is the point of a headline? I want y'all to put your answers in the chat. What do you consider the point, the goal of a headline when you are writing one, when you are looking at one? What do you think it needs to have? I'll give everyone a minute to put some answers into the chat. To catch the reader's eye, grab attention, tell the story, to educate, attract, draw the reader in, tell people why they should read the story. Loving these answers. To invite the reader in, get someone to read, summarize the main point, inform, intrigue, invite. I like that little slogan. Set the tone of the article. That's for sure. Get people to click and read. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of themes here, right? Of invitation. It is an invitation for someone to read further, right? To tell them the main point of the story, but to ideally bring them in to find out more. Capture the main point. Exactly. Feel free to throw any more in there. Drawing the reader in. I see like catching the reader's eye, grabbing attention, another theme. Exactly. So that's an interesting place to start, right? That is where we do start from our journalism lens that, can't avoid the commercial interests of our work, right? We all are dealing with the same difficult news industry where we need to attract people to our work in order to make sure it's supported and we continue doing it, keep the lights on, so to speak. So I want to talk about not only what the point of headlines is, but why they matter. Obviously, if you're here, you probably already care deeply about headlines. You view this as an important thing. I will say there are many folks I talk to who are like, okay, the headline is just to bring somebody into the story. They have to read the rest of the story. Like, it's not the end all be all. It's just one part of it, right? And that's true. But some important things we know via research of how folks use the internet. We know that folks read more headlines than they do full articles. There was some research a few years back that said that about 60% of articles shared on social media were never clicked. So the user wasn't actually clicking through the article before they were even sharing them, right? So that's somebody reading that just a headline before they even, put their kind of stamp on it, endorsing somebody else to read it, whether that means they think it's true or whether they are just trying to share that information. And we also know some Neiman Nielsen Group research has shown us that people still primarily scan rather than read on the internet. We open a page, we are doing some letter shapes that we do. The F scan is common, where we kind of read the first line or first couple of lines, and then we drop down a bit, read the next couple of lines, drop down a bit. That's pretty common through eye tracking studies to see that folks do a lot of scanning. And we also know, of course, that publication is not saturation. When one story comes out, that doesn't mean everybody knows that information now. So we know that from folks' user experiences, what this means is that folks have a lot of time blocked out in their day for the rest of their lives going on, right? They have very little time blocked out in their day for news gathering, and a lot of people stumble upon news during their day via social media. And they are going to see, it's not that they just read headlines, right? It's that they're going to just see way more headlines than full stories they could ever read in a day, right? Imagine your own news diet, which, if you're working in news, is going to be different than the average person. But we're dealing with a fire hose of information, all of us, and so we have to make decisions to work through our media diet during our day. And one way we do that is through the cognitive biases that our brains have. As humans, we are all wired. We all have these mental shortcuts to process information in our brains. Because if we sat down and had to think through every single decision we were making, from walking, telling our legs to move, to breathing, we would all be exhausted by breakfast, right? So our brains have all of these biases. We don't always use them constantly, but they're really common heuristics that we use to save us time and energy. And those have big implications for headlines. One of those is the framing and anchoring effect, meaning the info that we learn first impacts how we interpret the rest of the information that we're learning. So as somebody mentioned in the chat, setting the tone of the article, really important. That whatever we are hearing first about something, it is often hard to backtrack and correct our interpretation of a fact if we've learned something different first, right? And this is a big problem with misinformation. And there's also the illusory truth effect, which means that sometimes when we hear something that feels familiar, we will actually believe it is true just because it feels familiar. Just automatically, it will ring truer to us because we've heard it before. And that's where not repeating falsehoods comes into play. We know with misinformation, we have to eliminate the repetition of falsehoods, because the more you repeat something, the more it will feel true, whether you are aware of where it came from or not. Rhyming is actually part of this too. Things that rhyme feel truer to our brains just because they're easier to process. They are easier for our brains to process, and so that gives us a kind of bias towards those thoughts. And then for us, there's the curse of knowledge in any information sharing industry, where it's really hard for us to imagine the perspective of someone who knows less about a topic. And you can see that problem pop up in all kinds of things in journalism, right? Where we might use some jargon, we might use some storylines that need more context if somebody is jumping fresh into a story. These are all things that make headlines matter a lot, because our brains are wired a certain way, and we're seeing a lot more of them than we're seeing of a full story. And then, of course, if you've worked in print, as I love this fake headline here, of the total chaos of trying to make a headline fit into a print space. And this is repeated on social media, right? This is just a random story from the Inquirer, my hometown paper, where you can see that under this red circle, in a social card where a link auto-populates a picture and a headline in a social media post, it often gets cut off. And so we gotta think about that too. What is gonna get cut off maybe at the end of our headline? Got a lot of constraints. Additional constraints and best practices. I'm sure all of you have heard a little bit of each of these before. We know if we're working in print, or we come from a print background, or have been educated in a way that is print heavy, we focus on making a headline a complete sentence, teasing the story. We might focus on using active voice, present tense, things we were taught with SEO, search engine optimization. There are constraints there where for Google to pick up your story, you might need to have a specific number of characters. We're told to write for humans, but what we're writing is for how humans use search engines. So how they ask questions, how they're searching for information. And sometimes that means packing in keywords from Google Trends. Social media, research has shown us that stories that have high emotional value, those that use high emotion in their headlines, whether it is happy or sad or anger, are much more clicky. If you create a curiosity gap, you tease a story, not quite clickbait, but leaving that room for a reader to learn more in order to invite them into the story. That's something we're conscious of now, when we're writing headlines. And so, of course, all of these things, might be, if you're depending on your newsroom or your organization, they might be handled by all different people. They might be something that's kind of just in the back of your mind while you're it. And so maybe it's influencing unconsciously how you're choosing words. It might be something you overtly have to do. You might have in your CMS a place to put SEO headlines that are separate from your main page, homepage headlines. There's so much that goes into all of this, right? The issue being, there's always going to be a new thing that we have to format for. Or there's always going to be a new medium, as we've learned over the past several years, as social media players have come in and out, as video has come in and out, and now is back to, more pivots to video, as AI comes into the picture. There's always going to be a new constraint on the actual formatting of our headlines, right? So what we need to think about most when we are writing our headlines, especially around something as important as elections facing us this year, we need to prioritize the needs of our audience over these short-term, relatively short-term commercial needs, which are, getting shared on a certain platform, because the platforms, as we've learned, are always going to change. The audience needing to build trust with our audience and with our community is not going to change. That community is always going to be there. And so for me, the point of a headline, to go back to this, really echoes a lot of what y'all are saying, but there's some slight change in priority or from some of those best practices for SEO or clicking online. So top of line for me, providing audiences with the most basic information, of course, right? We all have that at the top of our list. What is the basic information of a news event? But also we have to think about a headline as a place where they are an audience member is deciding whether to consume news at a deeper level. So do they need to learn more about something, or are they getting enough of the useful active information that they can then move on from? And ultimately, we need to help them make decisions about their lives, right? None of this is new information, but it's as you'll see, none of this says clicking through to this story, right? Or sharing it on social media. These things will happen if we are creating information that is useful to our audiences and they trust us and they need to learn more about an article. But most importantly, we need to provide them with that useful information up front first to build that trust. So I call my best practices here human impact optimization. It's a very cheesy phrase. I made it up. Feel free to use it. Feel free to never think about this again. But I think it encompasses my philosophy around headlines, just really focusing not just on how to get folks to click through to the story, but to give them the best user experience, which will inevitably build trust with your organization. And we're going to go through each of these things over the next few minutes. So the user experience over the algorithm, as I just mentioned, when we're working on SEO or social media, we're fighting against algorithmic engagement. These are things that we need. And so each of these ideas, right, you'll see that these are not either or. All of these headlines on our slides, all of the things in my previous list are a greater than symbol in the middle, right? It is not, don't worry about the algorithm, don't worry about engagement. We all live in a society in which we have to worry about these things, right? So I'm promoting to prioritize things in the back of your mind while you're creating headlines, while you're thinking about them over others, but not to ignore them completely, because we have to be realistic about the business side of our work, unfortunately. But what this means for me, prioritizing the user experience, is starting from a place where we got to pretend that the headline, maybe the social caption, and maybe the comments is all somebody will read. Because oftentimes that is, again, they're not going to have time to read every article that they see. So what does that mean? That means we got to front load important information. If we have life-saving information, if we have information that might change somebody's decision about an election, about how they feel about a candidate, that information needs to be not just in the headline, but when I say front load, I mean literally at the front. What we looked at before, because so many people get information via social media, that example of a social card where the headline gets cut off, it happens. We need to include the information literally at the front so that we're optimizing for the user experience. You never know how the way the social media platforms change. It's just important to put the information at the front, because we never know how long, based on screen size, all that stuff, somebody's going to get to read our headline. And because of that, we want to pack in context over keywords. Context is so important. I'll show you a great example of this. Of course, context is important, but it's equally important or more important in headlines, because sometimes this reveals the stakes of an event that we're talking about in an article. Again, you want to, if possible, check social media cards for those awkward cutoffs, because you never know what important information might get left off from a social card. If you use a CMS that has the ability to preview this, something WordPress based, there's often a widget where you can preview what a social media card could look like. Facebook and Twitter, which I refuse to call X, both also offer places where you can like debug a link and it will show you what the preview is. You can use that to check and get a feel for, what their current standards are. And especially around this time of year and heading into to the elections, we want to be putting ourselves in the shoes of somebody who might use a headline as misinformation, as a sense of legitimacy. If you're able to take a screenshot of a headline, not link to it, but it might have the logo in the background or a clear font or byline next to it, right? If your headline is vague enough and has not enough specifics that it could be used to promote an alternate meaning that would be useful to somebody creating misinformation, then it should be rewritten so that we can make sure that, if a screenshot gets around, that this has happened many a time where misinformation actors say, oh, look at this New York Times story, I'll tell you what it's about. If the headline makes it clear, then we don't have to worry as much about folks making up what the meaning of our headlines are. And that's, just one little thing that we can do in this misinformation battle. So here's some examples of this. These are two headlines from just a bit ago. You'll be able to see pretty quickly how much different the level of context here is. This first headline says Jim Jordan sent one of the texts revealed by January 6th committee. And then the second one says Trump ally Jim Jordan forwarded Mark Meadows' argument for Mike Pence to reject Biden electoral votes. Obviously longer. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But the difference between these is stark, right? The first one leaves you wondering, if you're not fully invested or engaged with political commentary, who is Jim Jordan? And also, what texts? Also, what were the texts about? What slant did they have? Were they helping? Were they hurting the cause? What were these texts about? This is incredibly vague, and maybe meant to click through, but also might just be the curse of knowledge, where the writer might just be assuming a lot of the audience's knowledge. The second version does a much better job of creating context here by characterizing for this relevant context that Jim Jordan is a Trump ally, and send an argument about Mike Pence rejecting Biden's electoral votes to try to overturn the 2020 election, which is what the relevance is to the January 6th committee. You might also notice that the second version, all of those names are keywords. This is also helpful in SEO, right? So you kind of get a double dip here, where you're not only creating more context for your audience, but it's also innately helping you arise in search, which, again, we're not completely ignoring the needs that we have on that side, but just reprioritizing them a bit. And sometimes you'll get extra benefits. Another example here on the left is a headline that reads, "Who is Mark Robinson, the Republican nominee for North Carolina governor?" Definitely going to talk about questions as headlines in a bit, but this questions as headlines are typically formatted for, again, SEO purposes, to help guide the search engine to an article. And as we're talking about local races, we're going to be doing a lot of explainers, right? A lot of explainers just like this. And we want to be not only providing SEO with a useful headline, we want to be providing our communities with useful information. Again, they're not going to get to click through every single story. How many candidates run in your local elections, right? There's a lot of information to take in. The one on the right, on the other hand, adds a lot of context with a very particular tone that names Mark Robinson as the Holocaust denying, gay bashing, extreme anti-abortion radical. That is a lot, packing in a lot of policy context to the name of Mark Robinson, which in this case is actually less important to a user who doesn't know who that is, right? If they're searching Mark Robinson, they might actually know who it is already. They want to know what his policies are if you're looking for useful information around an election. All right. The next thing here that I like to always show is this type of graphic. There's actually this graphic. Oh, I did cut off with the cropping of it. The creator of this but it continues, that knowledge goes into wisdom and all of these wonderful things. But this is a really important difference to me in showing just the facts, right? Creating the journalism idiom of, we're just providing the facts, the information, versus creating meaning from that, creating knowledge for a person, drawing the connections between the dots, literally, that in this image, which I love is a great example of this. We want to be creating meaning from the facts and providing it, again, that context as much as we can pack in, but creating meaning is a great way of showing our audiences that they can trust us to help them navigate something difficult, like the many decisions they have to make around an election. How to do that? Don't let misleading quotes stand alone in a headline. It's not uncommon to see a headline from a public figure that might be false or misleading just be the headline, right? It might just say person's name, quote, without any context for whether that quote is true or not. If that quote is misleading or false, it should not be standing alone in the headline, because that is not providing the context that it is not true. We can't assume that everyone will know what the facts are depending on the event. And we also want to make sure we are connecting the facts, something like a quote, to causes or consequences. And I'll show a great example of that next. And again, we don't want to repeat falsehoods just to create an SEO-friendly framework. There are a lot of ways to, like the truth sandwich method, to correct falsehoods. What we want to minimize as much as possible is repeating them, because again, the more you repeat something, the more it becomes familiar to our brain, whether we remember where it's from, who said it, or whether it's true or false. So here's some examples of that, of creating meaning from something. The first headline here is pretty recent, just from a couple weeks ago. Supreme Court declines to hear appeal from Black Lives Matter organizer facing damages suit. This is a suit with prominent activist DeRay McKesson involved, and the Supreme Court declined to hear it. He was being sued because of an injury to a police officer that took place at a protest that he organized. And what I love about the second headline here is, if you don't know what the Supreme Court case was about, which we can assume a lot of people will not know, the meaning of this is what's most important to US audiences, especially during an election year. That this decision let stand that he could be sued for these damages, which means that anyone organizing a protest in 3 states in the US, including Louisiana, and I believe it was, no, I'm not going to say it in case I get them wrong. The original court case was Louisiana. That you could face a lawsuit for any damages that happened during it by anybody associated with your protest, which makes it almost, fiscally irresponsible to host a protest, and is a big silencing mechanism for our right to protest. The second headline creates meaning from what happens when the Supreme Court declined to hear this appeal, right? Another great example of this is providing context and meaning. These second 2 headlines are both about the same speech. The first one says, in Veterans Day speech, Trump promises to root out the left. It does not question whether that needs to happen or not. It does not question the premise of what root out means. The second one, on the other hand, about the same story, highlights the use of his word vermin, and Trump calls political enemies vermin, and it puts in the historical context of what this means. Where has this else happened before? And it says, echoing dictators, Hitler, Mussolini. Providing this historical context is crucial. This is not just another insult hurled at an audience. This is something that is a pattern in history that we can recognize and provide to our audiences. That's really important to do in a headline like this. We can't assume that somebody will see that language and think, oh, it's just and not think, oh, it's just another, upsetting thing that he said. The history of the propaganda around calling marginalized groups or other groups vermin and the like is, well documented, and we should share that. My next best practice here is focusing, as always, throughout our journalism, but especially in a headline, of choosing human dignity over brevity. And what I mean by this is, when we are crafting a headline, sometimes, like I shared before, we have to fit within certain constraints, right? Whether that is size, length, what have you. But when we are talking about our subjects and our communities, using phrases and terms that are humanizing and not othering, not stigmatizing, avoiding labels is more important than a quick and clever headline. It might sound clunky. It might sound too long. On the internet, we have a lot more room, a lot more wiggle room, right, for a longer headline, and we should take advantage of that rather than focusing on whether something sounds nice, right? It's lovely. We're writers. We like our craft. It's lovely when when these things all align. But what's most important is focusing on the dignity of our sources. So again, avoiding stereotyping and shorthand. To do that, use human-centered language, and that means person first versus identity first language. This is a term borrowed from the disability rights movement. Person first, as an example, would be a person who has a disability versus identity first language, which is disabled person. Again, is a longer phrase, of course, but it is focusing on somebody as a person rather than identifying them by one part of their life. Speaking of parts of their lives, when we're talking about things somebody has experienced, for instance, homelessness or substance use, these are states, these are experiences, these are not inherent traits of a person. And we want to use language that reflects that and talks about somebody's experience, not not identifying them wholly as a person as one thing. And when we're talking about collective groups, we want to go for specificity over collective nouns like the poor, the homeless, because they are not accurate and not really giving our audiences the information that they need about these groups, as well as stigmatizing groups that are often already marginalized. So there's a great example of this. All three of these, the first two headlines are both from the New York Times. They're all about the same person. The first headline is the initial New York Times headline, "Once a homeless addict, a mayor takes on housing and drug crises." The second is from their newsletter referencing this story, and it says, "A mayor whose past informs his approach to homelessness and addiction instead." And I love this because they're both referring to the same story. The first one calls the mayor, says he was once a homeless addict. That is that labeling language that we don't want to refer to. Yes, it's short. Of course, it is shorter than the second headline, right? But what it does is turn this mayor in question into an object. It takes away the humanity from him and defines him as these two experiences. The third one I also love, this from another publication that says the mayor has known homelessness and addiction. The point of bringing this up was to show how it informs his policy. So showing that he's known homelessness and addiction rather than is defined by it is important. Of course, we're going to get to questions as headlines. Can't resist questions as headlines. I'll tell you right now, I don't like them. Want to avoid them at all costs, especially around elections. You might be familiar with Betteridge's law of headlines. Any headline that ends in a question mark can be answered by the word no. That is often the case, right? I will offer you my silly version, Nagle's law of headlines, which is that any headline that ends in a question mark invites the possibility that the answer is yes. That can be a problem. When we know the answer to a question, we should not be telling our audiences that it is up for debate. That is confusing. That opens the door to misinformation. We want to be clear. Just because a question mark is clicky makes somebody want to, again, that curiosity gap, want to find out more. It might be great for search engine purposes. It is not good for actually informing our audiences. Here's some examples of that. This is very recent. Did Biden have a senior moment in front of G7 world leaders? This is a problem. This did not happen, but putting the question mark on it leaves it open to interpretation that the answer might be yes. It wasn't. There was lots of misleading footage of Biden at a recent event that was used by lots of right-wing misinformation actors. The second one, the second headline here addresses that by saying he was giving a thumbs up to skydivers not wandering off. Another example that I would see all too frequently in the past few years, flu or COVID-19, which is worse? We already know the answer, right? The answer in here is that coronavirus is much more significant to the human body than the flu. And we should not be leaving that open to folks, especially when something contentious is being used in misinformation campaigns. When we know one is true, we should be saying that in our headlines, even if it stops a few people from clicking through, right? Of course, I see a question in the chat of what if the answer is yes. I still would not, either way, this opens up the possibility that the answer is no, right? Making something a question, presenting something as a question implies that the answer is unknown. And when the answer is known, we should be telling our audiences that straight up. Finally, we want to focus on accountability over false balance, especially in times of election polarization and the possibility of election denialism, right? So again, when we're focusing on a often largely two-party system, we need to remember that both sides of a story aren't equal just because they are on two sides. Should not be falsely comparing unequal actions in a headline or, in this framing of a story in general. But by comparing unequal actions, we do accidentally do that whataboutism. It implies it, right? If these two things are similar, then they could be presented to the audience as somewhat equal, perhaps. Want to avoid that. When we are talking about misleading quotes, misleading stories, or statements, early statements about, for instance, election results, we want to consider the source's track record with the truth when we are presenting that information. If we are not trusting that, if we have not yet debunked what they are saying, but they come from a place that has a bad record of telling the truth to the public, then we should not be using their quotes as a standalone headline and assuming that it is true, right? As the saying goes, if your mother says she loves you, check it out. That should be, applied here as well. And we don't want to attribute actions of the minority to an entire group or vice versa. We want to be specific about accountability. Here are some examples of that as we emphasize, again, causes, choices, and actors. Anything that we are talking about, we want to emphasize the choices that are made by humans and the actors involved, rather than referring to larger, vague, or systemic issues as if they are inherent or natural. We want to focus on who did the action, who created XYZ problem, who's responsible for solving it, and be really specific. Some examples of this, another Trump example. Trump had, this is a New York Times headline that said, had role in weighing proposals to seize voting machines. What was the role, we must ask? The second headline, I believe this is The Guardian, said Trump reportedly directed Giuliani to press officials to seize the voting machines. This is a much different way of framing this story, right? Of explaining what that role was. It is not biased to explain what the role of Trump trying to seize voting machines was, right? This is the truth. We need to tell our audiences what that was, and not vaguely say he had a role. We can characterize what the role was, especially again from a pro-democracy lens, if it was, in the effort to subvert the democratic process. Another example here is Biden joins Trump under scrutiny of special counsel investigating classified documents. This, similar to recent headlines around Trump's conviction and Hunter Biden's conviction, these are not of the same importance, right? We're not talking about two presidential candidates. We're talking about a presidential candidate and the son of a presidential candidate. Not insignificant, but they are not the same stakes to the US public who are making election decisions in the fall, right? This is an older example. But the second headline here explains that there are differences between the document dramas between Trump and Biden. They both exist. The document dramas are both real, but there are differences between them, and those should be clear. Now, here is a phrase I, again, made up. I love making up phrases. Ghost attribution. You're free to use it. This is when a sentence unloads a fact or even an opinion on some non-existent third-party subject instead of claiming it as a reportable fact. And the reason I dislike this so much is not because I don't think we should, use expertise to provide evidence for such a claim, but offloading a fact to a third party turns it into an opinion. And what I mean by this, and there's an example ahead. If you imagine a headline that says, for instance, equality advocates say new law banning redheads from being seen in public is bad for redheads, that presents it like only that particular group disagrees with this law, right? Though I bet the opposition is much bigger, and it's not just, their opinion that it's bad for redheads. It's pretty objectively bad for redheads if they are being banned from being in public, right? We don't need to attribute that reportable fact or the demonstration of that fact to one group. That actually turns it into an opinion. So for instance, phrases like racially tinged or racially charged, they become these scapegoats too. They prevent journalists from just plainly saying that something is racist by kind of attributing it to some ghostly third party, or using phrases like critics say, or some say, or this is purported to be, rather than just being clear about when something is an act of discrimination, or for instance, a clear impact to the environment or human rights. When those things are clear, we need to be really obvious about it. I see a question in the chat that is, what is Modifier? I'm happy to answer. Modifier is the professional development arm of Resolve Philly. Resolve Philly is a nonprofit newsroom based in Philadelphia, and I will talk a little bit more about that at the end, but just to give you information that is on our slides. So another example, here's an example of ghost attribution here, that this was a headline that got changed by the Wall Street Journal. The first said, the Kanye's West Twitter account locked over purported anti-Semitic tweet. The tweet in question, which I won't review, was blatantly anti-Semitic. We didn't need to attribute this to some purported third party who said it was. It just was. And they received criticism for that. And they eventually, because of that criticism, rightly changed the headline to take out that word. So that's what I'm talking about here, that kind of ghost attribution. And finally, talking about community impact versus objectivity. This is going to be really crucial in election season. And we're going to get the chance to rewrite some headlines very soon. But this is something I want to spend some time on, because we often, in the language and framing conversations around journalism, get stuck on what is the most objective. We're trying to be objective. We're trying to be, as balanced as possible, and be, coming from a place that feels, or at least appears, unbiased. And then it makes it really hard for us to make decisions, especially around polarizing conversations where there might be two or more phrases that are often associated with different sides of a debate, right? These are common questions within a newsroom. Which language do we use about this topic? Because this side says this and this side uses this. I want to give you a framework for thinking through that. One, before I get there, what is the community impact? I want to mention, you don't need to report on every poll that comes through your desk. There is evidence, and I could go on longer about this. There's evidence that shows polls are harmful to actually voter mobilization, because they feel like predictions and kind of demobilize people from going out to vote for their selected candidate, because they believe, quote unquote, that they're already in the lead, just from seeing all of the polls about them. They're also often, kind of biased in who they choose, and the scientific significance of those are up for debate, blah, blah, blah. So I'm just putting this out there as a quick note. We don't have to report on every single poll when we're talking about community impact in a headline, because it does have a significant one. But when we're talking about polarizing word choices, there's a few questions I want you to go through when you hit this conversation. Who is considered neutral in the debate, if anyone? There might not be a neutral party in this debate, right? This might be something that is so hotly contested that there is no neutral. But we got to think of who is considered neutral. I'll give you an example. In Philadelphia, there are sections of the city that have really high rates of drug use, and there have been attempts to create safe injection sites or overdose prevention sites in those neighborhoods. When going through a conversation with a reporter about those two ideas, they were like, well, City Hall is neutral. What City Hall uses, I'll use. City Hall isn't necessarily neutral, so they might be considered neutral, but we have to think through, is that actually the neutral party here? And then when we're thinking about community impact, we got to think about who stands to gain something by using X term in this headline versus who stands to lose something. There is no zero-sum game in journalism, especially when there is no true objectivity, right? There's always going to be something to gain, something to lose. We need to think through what those are, and then think, for our mission, for our newsroom, for ourselves, are we okay with contributing that impact, right? Is that something we're cool with. And that might be the case, great. But if it's not, then we need to make a different decision. But these are the things you should be asking yourself rather than saying, oh, okay, well, advocates use this phrase, so I'll just use whatever is opposite of that. Right now, we got to think about what the goals are and gains are for each party. And again, avoid using that institutional authority as a neutral point when they might not be neutral, like something like City Hall or the White House, etc. Here is a quick imaginary scenario to illustrate this, that there's kind of an opportunity cost to this. So if you say, you know, if we know the words here are, or the numbers here are made up, but the truth of this scenario is that public opinion polls have said for decades that Americans support the phrase public assistance over the phrase welfare when we're referencing the same policies in surveys. That part is true. The part I'm making up are the numbers here. So if you said, for instance, that research says the use of public assistance in media increases support of it by 5%, but the use of welfare decreases support by 1%, then we have to think through what is neutral here. Is neutral welfare just because its impact is the smallest? Or is that actually creating an opportunity cost, which is, you know, the 1 minus 5 of public assistance? And again, I'm not saying there's always an easy answer here, but these are the things we need to be thinking through of like what that impact actually turns into for our communities. And a final couple words on this before we get into some activities and questions. On election day, please discard in your headlines any phrases that imply that whoever's in the lead first is winning. So anything like the phrase in the lead, this person's ahead or behind, they are winning or losing. We know there is no winner decided until the count is finished, or we can, you know, confidently project the count. I'm saying somebody is in the lead when the, you know, certain precincts have been counted, etc. Not helpful to our audience. And that actually feeds into the election fraud narrative by looking like a candidate's win has dissolved or disappeared or been changed. When talking about mail-in ballots, they might lead to slower counts, not late counts. Late implies that something went wrong, right? If you're running late, something went wrong. It's just going to be slower, but it is actually the expected process of mail-in ballots being counted takes longer, right? It's expected. It's not an unusual thing, again, playing into the election fraud issues. And this is just a random piece here of information that researchers also shown that images of long lines in voter stories can also discourage people from going out to vote because they think the lines are too long and they won't have time. So unless your story is literally about like the lines are so long and that is the problem, that is the story, try to avoid using long line voter images with your stories that don't have to do with long lines because it can demobilize folks. Okay, we're gonna practice rewriting things, and at the same time, please pop in your questions. We have about 12 minutes left. I would love, and I don't have any preconceived notion of what these rewrites should be, but I would love to see your rewrites of this headline in the chat. If you have a question, please throw it in the Q&A and I will answer as folks are writing, and I'll give everyone about a minute or two to rewrite and throw theirs in the chat. Great question. Oh, you know what? I meant to also include the story if you'd like to read through the story. But yes, cleanup is an interesting phrase, right? What does cleanup mean? Cleanup sounds good, right? Is it? Unclear. Glenn's suggestion is, let's see, Ohio initiates purge of voter rolls, reviews voter rolls to ensure accuracy. Ohio attempts to alter voter rolls. Yeah, exactly. I love these rephrases. Everyone's focusing on the phrase clean up, which I appreciate because that's really the question here, right? That's characterizing, that's kind of editorializing on what this change is. without making clear to audiences what that is. So something like a purge or something like reviewing, which is more, neutral of, we don't know what the review, if there is motivation to this review. That is really helpful. Attempts to alter voter rolls. That also, this does come, if you see the story, come from the Secretary of State. That's also another thing you might think about, that Ohio, that is referring to, the entire state and presumably its governance. This is a decision by the Secretary of State specifically. That might be something to include. Scrub voter rolls is neutral. I think we could debate that. Scrub also refers to cleaning, right? And cleaning is generally seen as a good thing. So I don't know if that would be considered neutral. Organizes voter rolls. Again, thinking about, like, is this implying that the voter rolls are disorganized? Perhaps. I like this from Peggy Purdue. Ohio launches legally mandated removal of inactive registrations. Straight to the point. Wonderful. Doesn't, gets right to the idea of what is happening, why is it happening? Is it actually just something that usually happens anyway? And that, doesn't characterize it as something new. That's really helpful. Including the actor, Ohio GOP Secretary of State. There you go. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide, and I will also put I love all of these rewrites. You guys are making really great points and giving, I think, each other a lot to think about. We're going to do another, and I will also put the story, if this helps, in the chat here. And in the meantime, while you're writing, I do want to address, there was a comment about the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Some tips about that, these are my personal, thoughts and observations, are focusing on who has the most power in a situation. And this is kind of, for all, this is an evergreen statement, focusing on who has the most power in a situation and being clear about accountability and who is responsible. So for instance, phrases like the Washington Post for a while was using Israel-Gaza war. Gaza was not launching a war. Hamas specifically, which was elected in 2006 and through a contested electoral process, does not necessarily represent all of Gaza. Gaza's innocent civilians are being targeted. They are not responsible for the attacks on October 7th. So that should be, Israel and Hamas. We should focus on who the actors actually are. And as far as reporting on events as they unfold, again, being clear about what is not normalizing parts of this war and the attacks on civilians is really important, by making clear that these things are not normal and not accepted, because there is, a real part of human behavior in which when we read about things as not in a shocking tone or not in a, kind of punitive tone, we think of them as normal. That is what normalizing does. If we're just writing about things as, oh, this just happened, instead of being blatant about, oh, this or that is a war crime, this or that is a really unprecedented attack, we want to be really clear about not only who the causes and the effects of the war Israel has waged, but being really clear about the stakes of it and how unusual it is and how we don't accept this in other places. Yeah, in response to Maria's comment or question, how do you feel about Israel's war on Gaza / in Gaza? I would say war on makes more sense, because again, that is the actor, versus the Gazans and Palestinians living in Gaza are not the actors who, perpetuated the attacks on October 7th. That goes to Hamas, the responsibility for that. So yeah, I would say on Gaza, because that implies the effect on the civilians living there. Okay, we'll turn to this slide if folks have given a thought about this. And if you want to keep, I will keep answering questions in the chat as folks rewrite. This one is Trump GOP urge early and mail voting while continuing to raise specter of voter fraud. I'm really curious. Again, I don't have preconceived notions about this one, but I'm curious how folks might address this headline or think about rewriting it. Things to think about might be, making clear that the raise the specter is kind of mysterious. There's a kind of a ghost theme going on today. I'm kind of mysterious about, is voter fraud real? We should be clear maybe in this about the legitimacy of voter fraud claims, right? Maybe that is something to include in this story. And maybe this is a pretty recent headline, so maybe the kind of hypocrisy of urging one kind of voting while also calling that kind of voting into question. It might be, I see a couple of rewrites, and I'll also get to these questions in a second. Trump GOP urge early in mail voting and prepare to claim voter fraud if Trump loses. That is quite accurate, I would say, because they have not agreed to accept election results. Trump and GOP attempt to have it both ways, encourage early voting while denouncing it as fraud. I like that have it both ways thing. That points at the hypocrisy of it, while continuing to raise debunked claim. Great, I love that, including the notion that it is a debunked false claim is really important to our audiences. Trump GOP urged supporters to vote earlier by mail while falsely claiming they're liable to fraud. Great, I love this. These are wonderful. All right, and I'm going to move on to the next slide, and I will also just answer a final question on Israel and Gaza and the word genocide. That my personal opinion is that a lot of journalism relies on waiting for a judge, like a judgmental organization, a judging body, a judicial system to make a call before we are comfortable using a term because of the legal liability. And I hope we would recognize that if we can't trust those judicial bodies to make a decision in a timely fashion or in a way that does not support sites that have more power than those who they are attacking, then we should not be going by their definitions. And I think we should be clear about how many experts and people living in Gaza have referred to this as genocide, and recognize that there are different definitions between legal definitions and the popular definitions. Okay, this last one, or we have two more. So here's one more. The RNC is launching a massive effort to monitor voting. Critics say it threatens to undermine trust. RNC launched massive voter suppression effort. I like this because it's truthful about the meaning of the facts. What does the monitor voting actually mean? The oversight in question is meant to bolster claims of voter fraud, right? That is the stated goal of many public figures talking about not accepting the election results. And despite acknowledging or knowing that there is no evidence to voter fraud, continuing to create these efforts for oversight anyway. We need to acknowledge that. And here we go, some ideas. RNC launch our massive voting oversight sparks trust concerns. I like that. All right, and we'll do one more. Vote by mail's popularity plummets in Duval. I believe this is, I'm not going to say where it is because I don't remember where I got this from just the other day. Could mean long lines in November. What do we think about this? One idea for me is, feels like it's predicting something that we're not 100% sure about. Were the lines in Duval very long before? Yeah, also plummets is spelled wrong. All right, we will wrap up. So any final ideas about this headline? Duval mail voting drops, long lines expected in November. I think that's more definitive. I appreciate that if they have that knowledge. All right. See, we're slowing down, so I will just remind you all, fewer mail-in voters so far this year in Duval. There we go. That doesn't make any predictions. Voters in Duval move away from absentee ballots. Again, not making any predictions about it. Very useful. These are great rewrites. I'm really happy we did this. Thank you all for contributing. I just want to remind you all that I am Aubrey Nagle. I work for Modifier, which is powered by Resolve Philly. We do professional development for newsrooms and journalists on the topics of collaboration, community engagement, language and framing like this, and workplace culture. Please reach out to me at aubrey@resolvephilly.org if you have any questions. And thank you all so much for joining us.
All right. Thank you so much, Aubrey. That hour went really fast. And thank you for offering all these ideas to rethink about how we're writing headlines this election season. I learned so much from this. I know the participants did too, just based on the chat. This was really great. I just want to thank everyone for their questions and their chats they offered to one another. We will share a link to the video later this afternoon, the recording of this, so you can keep mining this hour for instruction and for guidance. I know Aubrey just said she's also available too for future conversations. We'll also be asking you to fill out a survey as well, which you hope you will fill out because it helps us inform future programming for you all. So you may also reach out to me. The email is in the chat, and we hope that you will join us for future National Press Club Journalism Institute's events. And we have a virtual design event coming up in July and another one on story structure in August. We hope you'll check them out. In the meantime, enjoy the rest of the first day of summer, and thank you again.